In 1949, a 34-year-old war veteran stood in a wooden shed in southern Germany, staring at a machine that would change construction forever. He had no factory, no investors, no orders, just an idea that everyone said was impossible. His name was Hans Liebherr, and what he built in that shed would grow into one of the world's largest machinery empires, a company that today employs over 50,000 people and generates 14 billion euros in annual revenue. But this isn't just a story about cranes and excavators. This is a story about a fatherless boy who survived the Eastern Front, returned to a devastated homeland, and refused to accept the word impossible. This is the story of how one German engineer stayed 10 years ahead of Caterpillar and built a legacy that would outlast them all. The making of a builder. Hans Liebherr was born on September 28, 1915, in the small Bavarian town of Kirchdorf an der Iller. He entered a world already consumed by war. The Great War, what we now call World War I, was tearing Europe apart. When Hans was just 2 years old, his father was killed in action. Like millions of German children of his generation, Hans would grow up fatherless, his childhood marked by poverty, rationing, and the shame of national defeat. His mother eventually remarried a man named Johann Baptist Liebherr, a master builder and construction contractor. It was this stepfather who would shape Hans's destiny. The boy grew up on construction sites, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and cement, watching men transform raw materials into structures that would stand for generations. These weren't just buildings to young Hans. They were proof that creation could triumph over destruction, that from nothing, something extraordinary could be built. Hans proved to be a gifted student with a particular talent for mathematics and engineering. He didn't just want to build, he wanted to build better, faster, more efficiently. By his early 20s, he had completed his training as a master builder and was working in his stepfather's construction business. He began to see the limitations of existing construction methods. Cranes were massive, stationary beasts that required extensive setup. Moving them from site to site was a nightmare of logistics and expense. There had to be a better way. But before Hans could explore these ideas, history intervened again. The soldier. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within 2 years, Hans Liebherr found himself drafted into the Wehrmacht, assigned to the Eastern Front, arguably the most brutal theater of the most brutal war in human history. The Eastern Front was hell on earth. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Supply lines collapsed. Men fought not just enemy soldiers, but starvation, frostbite, and disease. Of the millions of German soldiers who fought in the East, 1 in 3 would never return home. Hans Liebherr was wounded in action. The details of his injury remain private, but we know it was serious enough to require extended recovery. And we know something else. It didn't break his spirit. While recovering, while watching his country's infrastructure crumble under Allied bombing, while witnessing the collapse of everything he had known, Hans began to think about what would come after, what Germany would need to rebuild, what tools would be required to resurrect a shattered nation. He thought about cranes. The invention. The war ended in May 1945. Germany lay in ruins. 80% of major cities were destroyed. Bridges were down. Railways were twisted metal. Factories were rubble. 12 million people were homeless. But amid this devastation, Hans Liebherr saw opportunity. Germany would have to rebuild. And to rebuild, it would need cranes. Thousands of them. But the traditional cranes of the era were part of the problem. They were massive, expensive, and required permanent installation. Moving them between job sites took days or even weeks. Hans envisioned something revolutionary. A tower crane that could be transported by truck, assembled quickly, and moved from site to site with minimal effort. A mobile tower crane. In 1949, working in a small wooden shed in Kirchdorf with a handful of local blacksmiths and metalworkers, Hans began to build his prototype. He called it the TK-10, the first designation in what would become a legendary product line. The TK-10 was ingenious. It used a telescoping tower design that could be transported horizontally on a standard truck bed, then erected vertically at the construction site using its own hydraulic systems. The setup time was reduced from days to hours. Hans knew he had created something special. In the spring of 1949, he loaded the TK10 onto a truck and drove to the Frankfurt Trade Fair, Germany's premier showcase for industrial innovation. He set up his booth with pride. This was his moment. Orders would pour in. His company would be launched. The fair opened. Visitors walked past. Construction companies examined the TK10, nodded politely, and moved on. By the time the fair closed, Hans Liebherr had received exactly 0 orders. Most men would have quit. Hans had invested everything he had, his savings, his reputation, his future. He was 34 years old with a wife and growing family to support. The smart thing to do would be to admit defeat, return to conventional construction work, and forget about mobile cranes. Hans Liebherr was not most men. The breakthrough, Hans refused to give up. He knew the TK10 worked. He knew it was better than anything else on the market. If customers wouldn't come to him, he would go to them. He began making personal visits to construction companies across southern Germany. Not just sales pitches, demonstrations. He would show up at construction sites, offer to set up the TK10 for free, and prove its value in real working conditions. Slowly, skepticism turned to interest. Interest turned to orders. Orders turned to a waiting list. By 1950, Hans had moved production from the wooden shed to a proper factory building. By 1952, he was hiring additional workers. By 1954, Liebherr cranes were being used on major construction projects across West Germany. But Hans wasn't satisfied with just cranes. He saw the same problems, the same inefficiencies across the entire construction equipment industry. In 1954, Liebherr introduced something that would shake the heavy machinery world: Europe's first hydraulic excavator. Traditional excavators used cable systems, complex arrangements of winches, pulleys, and steel cables that required constant maintenance and were prone to failure. Hydraulic systems used pressurized fluid to power precise, powerful movements. They were more reliable, more efficient, and offered far greater control. American companies like Caterpillar were years away from adopting this technology. Liebherr was already perfecting it. This became Hans's philosophy: identify the future and build it before your competitors realize it's coming. Stay not 1 year ahead, but 10 years ahead. This approach required something most companies couldn't afford: patience. Hydraulic technology was expensive to develop. The initial models had problems. Competitors laughed. Industry publications were skeptical. Hans kept building. He understood something that his competitors didn't. Short-term thinking builds products. Long-term thinking builds industries. The empire. By the 1960s, Liebherr was no longer just a crane manufacturer. It had become an industrial conglomerate. Hans made a decision that shocked the construction industry. He entered the refrigerator business. Critics called it a distraction. Hans called it diversification. He understood that a company dependent on a single industry was vulnerable to economic cycles. When construction slowed, he wanted other revenue streams to sustain the business. The Liebherr refrigeration division would eventually become one of Europe's leading manufacturers of commercial and domestic refrigerators and freezers, a business that today generates billions in annual revenue. In 1958, Hans opened Liebherr's first factory outside Germany, in Killarney, Ireland. This facility would produce hydraulic excavators for the British and Irish markets, but it represented something more significant. Liebherr was becoming a truly international company. Over the following decades, the expansion continued: France, Austria, Switzerland. By the 1970s, Liebherr had facilities across Europe and was beginning to eye global markets. Hans even entered the hospitality business, constructing and operating luxury hotels in Germany and Austria. To most industrialists, this would seem like another distraction, but Hans saw it differently. Hotels required sophisticated climate control systems, Liebherr refrigeration. They required specialized construction equipment, Liebherr cranes. They were both customer and showcase for his technologies, but perhaps Hans' most remarkable achievement wasn't any single product or factory. It was the management philosophy he established. principles that still guide Liebherr today, more than 30 years after his death. The philosophy. Hans Liebherr built his empire on 3 unshakable principles. First, remain family-owned. While competitors went public and answered to shareholders demanding quarterly profits, Liebherr remained 100% family-controlled. This allowed Hans to make decisions based on decades, not quarters, to invest in research that wouldn't show returns for years, to weather economic downturns without panic. Second, maintain zero debt. Hans had seen what happened when companies over-leveraged themselves. He watched businesses with promising technologies collapse because they couldn't service their loans during difficult periods. Liebherr would grow only as fast as its profits allowed. This discipline meant saying no to tempting opportunities, but it also meant the company would never be at the mercy of banks or creditors. Third, excellence above all. Hans refused to compromise on quality. Liebherr equipment would be more expensive than competitors, but it would last longer, perform better, and require less maintenance. In the long run, customers would realize they were getting exceptional value. These principles were tested repeatedly. In the 1970s oil crisis, in the 1980s recession, competitors who had grown faster through debt and acquisition found themselves struggling. Some went bankrupt. Others were absorbed by larger corporations. Liebherr endured. Liebherr thrived. Hans remained actively involved in the business into his 70s. He wasn't an absentee owner or a corporate figurehead. He visited factories. He spoke with engineers. He tested equipment personally. Employees at every level knew him not as a distant billionaire, but as a master builder who understood their work because he had done it himself. This hands-on approach created a corporate culture that persists today. Liebherr employees aren't just building machines. They're carrying forward the vision of a man who survived a war, built something from nothing, and proved that excellence and integrity could triumph in a competitive world. The legacy. Hans Liebherr died on October 28, 1993, at the age of 78. By then, the Liebherr Group employed 15,000 people across 46 companies, generating $2.5 billion in annual sales. But the story didn't end there. Hans had prepared for succession carefully. His children, Willi, Isolde, and Hans Dieter, had been groomed for leadership, learning the business from the ground up. Control of the company was structured to ensure family unity and prevent destructive conflicts. Today, more than 3 decades after Hans's death, the Liebherr Group employs over 50,000 people across more than 140 companies. Annual revenue exceeds 14 billion euros. The company produces everything from massive mining trucks to aerospace components to maritime cranes capable of lifting 20,000 tons. It remains 100% family-owned. It remains debt-free. It remains committed to the principles Hans established in that wooden shed in 1949. The story of Hans Liebherr is more than a business success story. It's a testament to what one person can accomplish when they refuse to accept the limits others place on them. A fatherless boy who could have been consumed by bitterness became a builder. A wounded soldier who could have been broken by war became an innovator. An inventor who received 0 orders at his first trade fair became the founder of one of the world's greatest industrial empires. Hans Liebherr understood something profound. That true success isn't measured in quarters or fiscal years, but in generations. That excellence is not expensive, it's invaluable. That family and long-term thinking will always triumph over short-term greed. Today, when you see a Liebherr crane silhouetted against a city skyline, or a Liebherr excavator shaping the earth, you're not just seeing a machine, you're seeing the physical manifestation of one man's refusal to quit, one man's vision of what was possible, one man's gift to the future. From a wooden shed in Bavaria to every corner of the globe, this is the legacy of Hans Liebherr, master builder. And the most remarkable thing, the company he built is still following his blueprint, still staying 10 years ahead, still proving that his way, the patient way, the excellent way, the right way, works. That's not just a business success, that's immortality. If you found this story inspiring, leave a comment below. What entrepreneur or innovator should we cover next? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of remarkable individuals who changed the world.